Imagine walking for hours across frozen ground, every step landing on sharp stone and ice, your feet raw and aching, with no relief in sight. Not tonight, not tomorrow, because this is simply how you live. This wasn't a nightmare or a punishment. For roughly 99% of human existence, this was just an ordinary day. Every hunt, every migration across a frozen continent, every single step our ancestors ever took was taken on bare skin against rock, ice, and thorn. At some point, some exhausted person finally looked down at their sore feet and thought, "There has to be something I can put on these." That one moment of frustration eventually grew into an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, but it began as nothing more than a scrap of animal hide wrapped around a foot. Pinpointing exactly when that happened is harder than it sounds. Leather breaks down, plant fiber rots away, and none of it fossilizes the way stone does. So instead of hunting for the shoes themselves, researchers turned to the feet that once wore them. Anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus ran the numbers on ancient toe bones from across Eurasia and noticed a shift. People living more than 40,000 years ago had heavy, sturdy toe bones, shaped by a lifetime of gripping open ground. After that point, toe bones got noticeably thinner and weaker, despite legs staying just as powerful as before. That's exactly what you'd expect if something rigid started coming between the sole and the dirt, taking some of the workload off the toes. The same split showed up wherever Trinkhaus compared groups known to have gone barefoot against groups known for heavy footwear. His takeaway: people were likely wearing some kind of shoe by roughly 40,000 years ago, long before cave art, long before anyone crossed into the Americas. Physical proof, though, doesn't stretch back nearly that far. The earliest surviving shoes on the planet are a set of sandals pulled out of Fort Rock Cave in Oregon, buried beneath ash from the volcanic blast that later formed Crater Lake. Dating puts them at roughly 10,000 years old, twisted and woven from shredded sagebrush bark, using a technique too deliberate to be accidental. Around the same era, in colder regions, a completely different design was taking shape: closed leather footwear rather than open weaves. The best surviving example is a single cowhide shoe unearthed in an Armenian cave, cut specifically for a right foot, laced shut, and packed with grass, dated to roughly 5,500 years ago. Strip away the age, and it looks almost identical to shoes still worn generations later on the other side of Europe. Proof that different people, in different eras, kept landing on the same solution. If you want to see prehistoric footwear at its most refined, look at Ötzi, the frozen body that emerged from an alpine glacier in 1991, dated to around 5,300 years old. His shoes weren't one material but five: a bearskin sole for traction, a softer deerskin upper, bark fiber netting holding it together, hay packed in for warmth, and cowhide cord lacing it all shut. When scientists rebuilt the design and tested it in real alpine cold, it held up. No blisters, dry feet down to well below freezing. Someone with no written language out-engineered a decent chunk of modern outdoor gear. Then the purpose of shoes changed entirely. Somewhere around 3000 BC, footwear stopped being purely about survival and started signaling who held power. Tutankhamun was buried with 80 pairs of sandals, some of solid gold, purely ceremonial and never meant to touch a floor. A few had enemy figures painted onto the insoles, so that every royal step doubled as a symbolic act of conquest. Rome, meanwhile, treated footwear as military engineering. Its standard-issue boot, the caliga, was cut with an open lattice to keep feet from blistering on long marches, studded underneath with iron for grip, and, in a pinch, for kicking an opponent. Excavations at a Roman fort along Hadrian's Wall turned up thousands of preserved leather shoes, not just soldiers' boots, but children's booties and women's slippers, revealing that entire families, not just armies, lived on that frontier. One surviving letter from a soldier stationed there simply asks his family to send socks, arguably the most human sentence to survive from the entire Roman military record. Other cultures took the idea in very different directions. In China, the practice of foot binding, stretching across roughly 1,000 years, deliberately reshaped women's feet to fit impossibly small shoes, a brutal example of footwear used as a tool of social control rather than comfort. Japan solved wet ground with elevated wooden geta and woven straw zori, both built around a simple idea: lift the foot away from the mud. Medieval Europe took fashion to an extreme with the poulain, a shoe with a toe stretched out as long as 2 feet, sometimes chained to the knee to keep it from flopping. A design so impractical it functioned as a status symbol, since only the wealthy could afford to be that useless with their feet. A study of medieval skeletons later found bunion rates spiking dramatically during the poulain's heyday, hitting their highest among the wealthiest burials. Shoes, by this point, had become less about protecting the foot and more about announcing who you were. For roughly 2.5 centuries, shoes weren't even made for a specific foot. Left and right were identical, and wearers simply broke each one in until it molded to whichever side it happened to be worn on that day. That changed only in the mid-1800s, once factories could reliably produce mirrored pairs. The bigger leap came in 1883, when Jan Ernst Matzeliger, an inventor born in Suriname, patented a machine that automated the hardest step in shoemaking, stretching leather over the last and fastening it to the sole. What once took a skilled worker an entire day to do 50 times could now be done hundreds of times over, and shoes shifted almost overnight from a luxury few could afford to something everyone simply owned. A few decades earlier, Charles Goodyear had stumbled onto vulcanized rubber by accident, giving the world quiet, waterproof soles, and, indirectly, the word sneaker. Between the two breakthroughs, the modern footwear industry was born, now churning out something like 24 billion pairs a year worldwide. There's an odd twist to all this progress, though. Harvard researcher Daniel Lieberman has spent years comparing populations that still go barefoot regularly with those who've worn shoes their whole lives, and the barefoot groups consistently show stronger arches and more developed foot muscles. Cushioned modern shoes, by contrast, encourage a heavier heel strike that sends more force up through the leg with every step. In other words, the very invention built to protect the foot may be quietly making it weaker. None of this traces back to one clever person in one place. Shoes were reinvented independently across nearly every continent because the underlying problem was never local. The ground is hard, feet are soft, and no culture with sharp rocks or frozen winters ever had the option of ignoring that. Somewhere, tonight, a factory is pressing out rubber soles by the thousand. And 40,000 years ago, in some cave or on some frozen plain, a single person wrapped a piece of hide around their foot, stood up, and kept walking. Because for the first time, the ground didn't hurt.